Hi, everyone. My name is Bridget Richardson. I'm the Assistant Director of Ecumenical and Pastoral Initiatives at the Ed.D Center for Faith and Culture at University of St. Thomas in Houston. And I'm here today with three lovely ladies to talk about racism and education. So I'll just go around and introduce each one. We have here with us Nora Creech. She's an alumna of the Master of Arts in Faith and Culture program with the Ed.D Center for Faith and Culture. And she was also the chair of the Ed.D CFC Symposium last year on the Bishop's pastoral letter, Open Wide Our Hearts, which we'll share more about during our conversation. We also have Dr. Nicole Walters. She's the Dean of the Associate of Applied Science program at University of St. Thomas, and she's also an Associate Professor of Educational Leadership at UST. And then Elizabeth Creech, Nora's daughter. Elizabeth is an 8th grade humanities teacher and liturgical coordinator at Notre Dame Academy in San Diego, California. So everyone, thank you so much for the conversation today. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
We're glad to be here.
Yeah, so let's just kick it off. Let's kind of lay the foundation for the conversation on racism and education. So Nora, can you start us off with sharing about your encounter with this and also the Open Wide Our Hearts document, and what about that document kind of spurred you to understanding what racism is?
So when I was a student at the Ed.D Center for Faith and Culture, my primary emphasis of my study was on ecumenism, the study of Christian unity. And so the more I started looking into Christian unity, the more I realized that Jesus' prayer for us was, "May they all be one," from John 17:21, when it was Jesus' final prayer for his people. And so the more I meditated and prayed on that prayer, the more it occurred to me that he wasn't just talking about Christian unity or about interdenominational unity or cross religions unity. He was talking about the unity of all people and the fact that all people are created in the image and likeness of God. And so that really started to begin a transformation in my heart, where I started to look at my own biases, my own assumptions, my own prejudices, and being very convicted that I had some planks in my own eye that I needed to examine. And then I was made aware that the bishops were planning to issue a pastoral letter in November of 2018 against racism. And so that letter did come out in 2018, but it did not receive a lot of attention or publicity because there were a lot of other distractions going on in the Catholic Church at the time. So at the Ed.D Center, we were looking for a way to commemorate 25 years for the center. And we came up with the idea of having a day-long symposium to break open the bishop's pastoral letter and to expose people to what the bishops were saying. And I think the fundamental thing that we as Catholic Christians need to recognize is that the bishops are calling out racism as a sin. And they define it in several ways. It's a personal sin where there might be external acts of hatred, sinful acts against other people, but there might also be an internal in your heart where you might not express anything externally, but you might hold a position of superiority or think that your race is better, that is still a sin. And then the third thing, which is probably the one we don't talk about enough, is the sin of omission, where we see sinful acts and we stay silent. We don't do anything about it. And the bishop's letter really calls that out. So there's the personal aspect of sinfulness, and then there's also the institutional aspect, where there's practices and traditions that treat people unfairly just based on their race. Or the letter also talks about their country of origin, perhaps their culture. So there's also those institutional things. And so the letter quotes Pope Francis that says, what is needed is a personal, ongoing conversion. And so what we're here to talk about today is how do we initiate that conversion, and how do we educate ourselves and others through personal education and also through the educational system to have that conversion. So I'm going to just close with saying that the shape of the bishop's letter is following Micah 6:8, the prophet Micah from the Hebrew scriptures. And that scripture says, "You have been told what is good, what the Lord requires of you, And there's only three things. 1, to do justice. 2, to love goodness. And 3, to walk humbly with your God. So that's the shape of what we need to do to confront racism personally and within our culture. To do justice, love goodness, and walk humbly with our God.
Yeah, thank you, Nora, for that synopsis of the document. And also, I do like how it's all scripture, like it's tied within scripture in Micah 6:8. And you mentioned education, both personal education, but also within the system. So Dr. Walters has done a lot of work on this, continues to educate people in this way. So Dr. Walters, can you help us understand this from an educational aspect and see how what's happening in our culture does tie to how we're educated and also the educational systems that are in place?
Yeah, so I want to first say that I love the way that Nora has framed this, because I think we have to remember that as Christians, it's paradoxical to be Christian and yet espouse our superiority over other people. Because Christ knows, as believers, we know that we're supposed to bring everyone to Christ. And more importantly, those who are on the fringes of society, those who are marginalized, those who are underserved. And so I think that is such a beautiful reminder as we start this conversation, as educators, as parents, as teachers, those who love children in our community. We have a duty as Christians to remember that. And so it's a beautiful tapestry that's woven into my faith life as a faith-based educator, because it's really important for me to get the conversation out there that there are things that as teachers and principals and parents, we need to do. I love how Nora said, I had to first confront my own bias. And I do a lot of work in asking students, because I do teach teachers and future leaders, do you know what bias is? And, you know, the first thing is, I don't have one, Dr. Walters. I don't see color. And we think that we're saying the right thing, but we don't live in a colorblind society. Because the first thing I say to my students is, well, if we didn't live in a society with color, you wouldn't see the black top that I'm wearing with the white stripe down the middle, right? So there's color, and it's okay to accept that. But as educators, we have to be realistic that we do come with our own preconceived notions. So once again, I love how Nora said that, because that's where I frame every conversation, every teaching topic. It always starts with bias. And do you recognize it, and what can we do about that? The other piece is trying to make sure that we create a space in our educational systems to talk about this kind of stuff. So the first thing is, as a teacher, well, how do I confront these conversations? As an administrator, what do I need to do? Well, the first thing is you have to create a space to talk about race. Kids look and follow what we model and what we show them. And if we decide to not have the conversation, they'll find out on their own, whether it's through their peers, through their neighbors, through the television and media. Media is very important on shaping the lens, but we all have a frame of reference, and our frame of reference is what guides our thinking, how we grew up, our faith life or lack thereof, who we played with growing up, our family, our friends who we talked to in school, but that frames what we believe. So we have to create the space to have this kind of conversation. And the next thing we have to do is we have to look at the policies that govern the rules in our systems, whether it's our school systems, I work in a higher education setting, so I look at the policies that my students and faculty members look at. So we have to look at being very intentional on, is the curriculum diverse? Does it really embrace people that are not the majority? My husband and I talk all the time that oftentimes history books tell the tales of those who are historically in power. It's very limiting sometimes on those who are not. And so oftentimes we miss the contributions of other people, people of color, indigenous, women, folks who are, as I mentioned, the marginalized, those who are less than. And so we have to make sure that we are looking in our education spaces that allow us to have multicultural literature. And I love how last week Elizabeth said, but it can't just be one person. Remember that, Elizabeth? You want to share a little bit about like why you think that?
Absolutely. So I teach 8th grade in a Catholic school, social studies, English language arts, and religion. And so by the time students come to me in 8th grade, if I'm the first person who's having a conversation or creating the space to talk about race, that is really problematic because they've had all these other years of education where this hasn't been a part of the conversation. And they haven't seen for the last 7-8 years of their educational journey that there are people with diverse narratives, that history is a reflection of a whole group of people. And so it's really important that from kindergarten and first grade, students see books with multiple types of people that reflect what a classroom looks like. It should be as diverse as the students in your room. And so it's really important that the conversation starts early and not just in middle school or high school. It needs to begin at a very early age.
Yes, and it has to be, when we look at the faculty members who are delivering this, are they comfortable with it? Students know very quickly who's not comfortable, who they can press the button. And so we have to make sure that we do things like this, very intentional conversations, that we give our teachers and educators tools where they feel safe to have these conversations.
And the thing that I think is so helpful that the bishops issued the letter in 2018 is that as a Catholic educator, you have a tool available to you to say, this is what our church teaches. This isn't something new. This isn't something that just came out of the 60s or the Black Lives Matter movement. This is foundational to our faith, that we believe all people are made in the image and likeness of God and deserve that dignity and respect. So I think it's a good tool for educators to refer back to.
Especially because at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned the sin of omission, that not standing up or taking action puts you as much at fault as actively being racist. And so as an educator, it's my job in the classroom to make sure that the space is created to have these conversations so that the narrative changes moving forward. And so not only do we have the bishop's letter, but my absolute favorite part of being a Catholic educator is sharing Catholic social teaching. And so they're the principles that define our faith and help us to deal with issues like racism in our modern world. What does the Catholic Church teach about people? Well, we're all created in the image and likeness of God. There is the dignity of life of the human person, that we are expected to promote solidarity of the entire human family, that we are expected to love one another and to fight for those who are poor and marginalized, to care for the marginalized individual. And so my job as an educator is to make sure that Catholic social teaching is at the forefront of my classroom environment, and that students recognize that Jesus was the most anti-racist. He spent time with people on the margins, and that's what we're called to do as well. And so there's plenty of tools out there for educators, especially in a Catholic space, to use those resources to say this is fundamental to who we are.
Yeah, I love how I want to go back to omission. I think that is so important, because the other piece is when you omit, you invalidate the experiences of others. So if you have students and families that are of color, and you're not and you're basically saying, oh, it doesn't exist, or you just ignore it, you're invalidating their experiences, you're invalidating their perspectives, their identity is tied into their race. So we have to make sure that we are not promoting the status quo. And I really like that, Elizabeth, that you reminded your students that we are of the faith of, we teach Catholic social justice at UST. That's the first thing in the School of Education, where I'm also duly appointed. We talk about that. That is the first night of our lecture, is everything that we're doing is guided under the umbrella of our Catholic social justice teaching. And you don't have to be Catholic to follow them.
Right.
They're just like you said, it's just we respect the dignity of the human person, that everyone has a right to be here. And, when you're talking, I think it was Nora who mentioned, when you're talking about lives that matter and the Black Lives Matter, and how this just didn't start with that. People need to understand Black Lives Matter is not anything new. It is saying fundamentally that we can't let all lives matter if we don't make sure that these lives that are inherently disproportionately at risk in our justice system, not being treated equitably, not being respected as the dignity of the human person. And, you're not saying that all lives don't matter. You're saying all lives can't matter if you don't recognize this atrocity and make sure that we're speaking out against that. And I think that's sometimes where the language gets a little uncomfortable, because people haven't done their due diligence and they don't read up about it and they don't engage in conversations like this where you can unpack these kinds of topics.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that fact about justice, because that's the first part of that Micah quote, is to do justice. And the letter really emphasizes that the original meaning of justice was to be in right relationship with God and with other people. And the only way to be in right relationship with others is to know them and to know their stories and to hear them. So if they're not being exposed to people who are different from them in school, then they will not know other people. And it makes it very challenging to grow up and be an effective voice for justice. So it really does need to start in the elementary school years, or even before.
Even before kids, they take, they follow what we provide them. And if we don't expose them and have the conversation, then they come up with their own rationales.
Mm-hmm.
So in this climate that we're in right now, I'm so interested to know if a teacher is trying to start educating people in this way, or educating their students. There's got to be a lot of fear going into that if they've never talked about it, especially if those students weren't educated at kindergarten in this line of thought, in correct teaching of Catholic social teaching. How does that transformation happen in the classroom, and how does that transformation expand to the parents too, so that they have a deeper understanding of what a teacher is trying to show their students and their whole classroom?
Who do you want to take that, Bridget? Me or Elizabeth or Nora?
Whoever feels the spirit.
Well, what does it look like in your classroom, Elizabeth? Because I'd love to hear, because you're coming from a perspective, you're on the front lines.
Absolutely. So I guess a couple of things come to mind. To give you some background on my educational experience, I did a program called Place Corps, which stands for the Partners in Los Angeles Catholic Education, and we serve under-resourced Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of LA. So I served for 3 years at a school in Inglewood, and we were Title I, 75% free or reduced lunch, and I had all students of color, 50% Black, 50% Hispanic for the most part. And then I moved to San Diego, and I teach at another Catholic school, but it is not under-resourced. It's very resourced. And we have a much wealthier population. It's still pretty diverse, but it is definitely a higher socioeconomic group of students and a lot more white students. And so I have these opposite experiences, and addressing racism looks very different in both of those, and also looks very the same. So just for example, in my previous environment in Inglewood, one experience that really stands out to me is one day students were playing basketball on the yard, and they came in laughing from recess. And so I just asked them, what were y'all doing? And they said, oh, we were playing basketball and we divided the teams. We had the Mexicans versus the Blacks. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Let's have a conversation about that. Why did you choose to divide the teams that way? And they said, well, because they look like this and we look like that. And so it was an easy way to divide each other up. And I said, okay. And Eduardo, are you Mexican? And he said, no, I'm from El Salvador. And I said, okay. And Brandon, where are you from? And he said, I'm from Guatemala. And I said, so are you Mexican? And they said, no. And I said, what's the difference between being from Guatemala and from El Salvador versus being Mexican? And they started to talk about the differences in their culture and in their ethnicity and the way that they celebrate and practice who they are and where they come from. And then I turned to the group of African-American students and said, what is your heritage? Where do you come from? And some of them, all different types of narratives, all different types of stories. And we had this really beautiful organic conversation about what happens when you label groups like this. What if I, as the teacher, had divided you that way? How would that make you feel? What if you didn't have the choice to divide yourself that way? Let's talk about the history of how this looked in our country. Why is this problematic? Why is this a form of marginalization? what would Jesus say about this behavior? And so I say all this to say there are moments every day in a classroom setting, whether that's at recess or at lunch or in your classroom, where you hear things that are said. And if you don't address them as a teacher, that is extremely problematic, because they thought it was funny. They thought there's nothing wrong with this. We're just doing what we see in the world. And it's a funny way to divide our teams and play basketball and make jokes and stereotypes about what Mexicans are like versus African Americans in our country. And that conversation changed the rest of the year, and led us to have conversations for the rest of the year that I think really helped to open their viewpoint and recognize this language and this behavior is problematic, not only for the other who I'm treating as the other, but also for myself and what I'm choosing to label and say is okay for me. So that is one really empowering piece and conversation in a space where people are very diverse. And then I shift to my more affluent neighborhood or more affluent space, and it's very intimidating to have conversations around race. And I think part of the reason why is there are a lot of adults, the parents are much more involved in this particular community because they have the time and the resources to be involved, which is a blessing, but they also are very uncomfortable with having conversations around race. And as a young white educator, it can be challenging to create the space in the classroom and to say, this is what we believe as Catholics, this is what we know is right, and have people who haven't yet done that work and who feel uncomfortable having those conversations and you having that conversation with their child or their student. And so, Dr. Walters, I know you have a ton of different ways to gently bring people into that conversation. I think I create that space in my classroom through the literature that we're reading, the different things that I hear that students say and unpacking those. But I guess I'd love to learn from you how to better create that space in that conversation with parents, because in a classroom setting, we have that kind of that sanctity and that safety, but kind of broadening that conversation to families can be a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, so I think, you do things very gently sometimes because you don't want to make a situation that's difficult and uncomfortable, for you. So the first thing is you have to get support and buy-in from your administrative team. Your school, like we said the other day, you can't be the Lone Ranger out there having this conversation on your own, because then you're an anomaly and it's not normalized. This should be a normalized conversation, again, as Christians, as faith-based leaders, of knowing that we have a duty, a moral obligation to espouse that racism is a sin, as Nora reminded us so beautifully. It's a sin, as the bishop has reminded us, it's a sin. So I think the first thing that you do is you go to your administration and ask, how comfortable do you all feel as a building? What are we espousing that's going to be our vision and our mission as Catholic leaders? What do we believe, right? So you start there and then ask them, do you feel comfortable with me doing some very small, exercises and conversations with my class? And could we do this as a team? Maybe we do a team. You started out with a team, a few teachers, because there are other teachers, I'm sure, with you that would not feel uncomfortable with, doing some things, right? And then the third thing I would do is I would ask the parents in a survey, because you don't want to put people out there, and just ask them, how comfortable do you feel? And you give them a Likert scale, very comfortable, not comfortable, and let them share their thoughts. Everyone comes, again, with their own frame of reference. Some people may not have grown up having these kinds of conversations, and they just don't have the tools and the language to give our kids. That's what it starts with, really. It's about us providing the tools and the vocabulary and the language for our parents to feel comfortable having the conversations. The other thing is what I love doing. I love role playing. It's a way to allow, it's called didactic thinking, where you allow one student to get in the mindset of another. So I've written these scenarios, and I'm so happy to send them to you. And I use them all the time when I'm training. And it's these scenarios where, you have someone sitting in a classroom and a student says a racial slur, and the teacher ignores it. And then another student hears it and wants to talk about it. And then it's what would you do? And you allow your kids to talk about it. It's a very safe way. They're not arguing. It's just a way to get the conversation started. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, no, I'm sorry. You're going to.
Oh, no, that's okay. I just was going to say I'm not an educator, but I am a parent, and my children I was that parent that Elizabeth is talking about. I was the parent in the affluent, mostly white Catholic school, and if this issue had come up in my children's classroom at the time they were going through, I would have been uncomfortable, and I wouldn't have had the right language. I wouldn't have had the right understanding for how to confront these issues, but I hope I would have welcomed the opportunity. And so this kind of leads me to the second portion of the bishop's letter, which is to love goodness. And if we recognize that love is the heart of the Christian life, and that what Jesus taught us is that we are to love one another, and that we have to always make room in our heart for the other. And Elizabeth pointed that out, that Jesus was the greatest anti-racist and embraced everyone. So you have the luxury within Catholic education to really focus on the fact that Jesus is our role model. And so speaking as a parent, casting myself back 15 years ago when my children were in Catholic school, thinking about what would have been effective for me, it would have been couching it in the language of our faith, about what we hold as important is that Jesus tells us to love one another. And that doesn't mean people that just look like us. It means love everybody. And as Christians, we believe that the Holy Spirit is in all believers. And if we don't know people that look different from us, we're missing some aspects of how Jesus reveals himself in those other people. And so that's sort of one of the things that helped me to be open to these conversations. And you're very kind to say that it should be gentle, because as I told you, I just finished reading the book, White Fragility, and she points out very clearly that white fragility has made it so that other people have to be worried about how we're going to respond when they're the people who have been marginalized and had their rights stepped on. And so you're very kind and generous to come from a gentle perspective, but maybe we need our world shaken up a little bit too.
Well, but I will tell you, the way I train my teacher educators and the way I train my principals and faculty members are there, and when I go and train corporations, is very different. So I'm coming from the notion that Elizabeth is one of very few people who are, very comfortable having this conversation. And I don't want her to be in an uncomfortable situation on her campus, as I share with all of my teachers. I don't know your landscape. Only you know your landscape. And so you're right. It is the fact that, we have these conversations and it's like, oh, we have to be very careful. But I am very mindful that everyone's situation is very differently. When I'm having conversations on social media, my conversations are very different because I'm coming across as Dr. Walters, who is a faculty member, but who also I sit on the board of the Inclusion Institute of Excellence, and our conversations are way more out front, in your face. This is how it is. But when I'm in schools, I have those kind of conversations of, how comfortable, because I come in and I know very quickly who's ready to accept it. And they're like, yes, I'm ready. And I know others who they sit there for 2 hours and they nod and they say yes, and then they go back to the status quo. And, I have gone in and I've met some lovely people, but they're very comfortable with the status quo. So only Elizabeth and others who are viewing this podcast would know how comfortable they should be. But White Fragility is an excellent, excellent book. I met the author a year ago at an author talk, and really brilliant. I don't know if you're familiar with Peggy McIntosh's work. Peggy McIntosh, who talks about white privilege and what that is, and how do we unpack that, and how do we identify it, and what is it? I teach multicultural populations, and I always have, every single class, I'll have one student, well-intended, to say, no, Dr. Walters, I don't believe in white privilege. I don't even know what you're talking about. And then I have to unpack it and say, just very mildly, when you're stopped by the police, are you sure that you're stopped for running a red light or speeding? Sometimes people of color, they aren't sure. We had someone who was killed, George Floyd was killed because they thought he passed a counterfeit $20 bill. That still is, remains to be seen, but he was killed. We have seen others, whites, who have done far grander crimes be let go. The young man who blew up that church in South Carolina, they took him to Burger King, gave him a hamburger for lunch, let him get in the car, wasn't shackled at all. So I don't say that to politicize it, but I say things to illuminate and elucidate what's going on in our country, and for them to understand that white privilege is very real. And until we identify what it is and understand how we have to unpack that systemic racism, we will continue to have the same errors that we've had. So
yeah,
you're right. You do have to be in your face.
Yeah, but a lot of the things y'all are saying have to do with, systemic racism, and also even in Elizabeth's story, that gentle way of helping people come to a higher understanding of even the way that we are sectioning off ourselves in groups. And the thing that I think is beautiful about what you're approaching, Elizabeth, even in a gentle way, honestly, with your students, is that you are helping them see more uniquely who they are through that conversation. So you are helping them understand who they are in their personhood, understand their own human dignity in their ethnicity in such a beautiful way that helps them see beyond what they think they are. So as a teacher, in the classroom, it's y'all are, you have lesson plans and ideas for helping people have this conversation. But what you and Dr. Walters are almost talking about too are the intangibles of being a teacher, opening your eyes, not omitting what your students are saying, seeing how they interact with each other, seeing all of the ways that they're playing together. Dr. Walters, you probably have experiences of seeing, in higher education, students reacting and talking with each other outside of the classroom. So how do you instill that transformation in teachers to be more aware of those things that are happening around them, so that when they can take things to the classroom, it is very action oriented because they know where their students are coming from, trying to reset their frame of reference?
Yeah, but so remember, it's not about resetting it. So your frame, again, is bringing in your experiences. So you want to welcome their frame, right? You want to say that as a Black woman, who grew up in a Catholic and Baptist home, I have two very strong perspectives on faith. It guides every single thing that I do. So I'm very uncomfortable at times if I'm in spaces that I can't share that, but I know that that's what it is. But my parents are very intentional to put me in places and spaces where I could celebrate being a Catholic Baptist girl, learning both faiths. You know what I mean? So teachers have to accept what students bring, and they have to acculturate them in that landscape to make them feel like they're part of the classroom and the environment. Higher education is really fun because we get to see so many kids with different perspectives, and but they're all learning. I like to call my most favorite group are my freshmen, because I like to call them my 13th graders. They just graduated from high school, but they're not quite ready to fly. So they're my 13th graders. And they have these ideas that college is going to just be like high school. And I'm like, it's not, it's different. We're teaching you how to be independent. We're teaching you how to think, but they're also being around people that they may never have grown up around or been exposed to. And so we try to really develop activities that allow them to be in spaces with other people. So even my kiddos who are my athletes, because when you're in a group, it's kind of cool to say, well, I'm only a baseball player and I only hang out with the baseball players, or I only play golf, or I only hang out with the golfers. But we tend to throw them in spaces and very intentional situations where they have to interact with each other. And we do that at UST in a really fun place called Freshman Symposium, where they meet once a week for an hour with a team, and we do different things that get them basically acculturated to being a freshman on campus for the first time. And so teachers have an opportunity to do things like that, where, you engage in conversations, you do your own work, meaning, you want to research, well, how do we have these conversations about race and space in the classroom? It's just as easy as that. It's looking it up. How do I, the internet, oh my gosh, if I were a teacher with you right now, Elizabeth, we would be rocking and rolling. I'm telling you, because I didn't have these great resources when I was in school, learning how to be a teacher that are at your fingertips. So you have, your mom, you have now me, you have the internet, you have your colleagues. There's so many ways of engaging these kinds of conversations, but you just have to be willing to do it. And you also have to be able to be a risk taker, which I've always been that person. So, and I think you are too. And I love the way that you do it in a like you said, in a gentle way, because that was really beautiful and organic with your students. I would be interested if they went home and share with their parents what happened in Miss Creech's class that day.
I think one of the most important things, just to add on to you, Dr. Walters, is giving students language, because a lot of times their hearts are so good. Children are really close to Christ. They really understand our faith in a way that adults really struggle with. I think we get, bombarded with the world, and we get attacked by the messaging. And so students really firmly believe and have a really deep faith in who Jesus is. And so a lot of times the difficulty is giving them the language to be able to express what's happening or what's going on. And so talking about bias. What is bias? How do you recognize it? And then more importantly, what do you do in a classroom as a student if you are the kid who hears someone else make a racial slur? What do you do to approach that situation? What language, what literal statement can you say, or to take to the teacher if you don't feel comfortable addressing that student, to make sure that that does not go unnoticed? And so being really explicit with students about language that can be used either at home or in the classroom is really, really important.
And modeling that language, right? So again, for me, role playing is really great because you give them an opportunity to play with the language and to, and I always like to say, well, let's unpack this. How did this feel? And then I just wait them out, because sometimes they're silent. I'm like, Dr. Walton can wait just as long as you need to. But we're going to get something. And, you kind of make them, like you said, Nora, you kind of make them get out there and be very intentional.
Well, this is kind of a funny story, but you said for Elizabeth that she had me as a resource. And I'd like to say that she's actually been my resource. She's the one that has opened my eyes. And I'll tell you, the first time I really became aware of even having the language to have this kind of conversation was when Elizabeth was in high school and we took a trip together to Papua New Guinea. And it was a part of a kind of a mission trip and a Girl Scout action. And so we were in Papua New Guinea, and the native people of Papua New Guinea have very dark skin. Mm-hmm. And I made the comment that if a person from Papua New Guinea came to the United States, would you call them a Papua New Guinea American? Or would you call them an African American? Or would you call them a Black American? And the people we were with laughed at me, like, that's a ridiculous thing to say. But I didn't know the answer. I still don't know the answer.
I was going to ask, what's the answer?
But it was the first time that I started asking a question like that, like how, like what Elizabeth was saying before, how you define people, how you acknowledge them has impact. And it really was opened my eyes for the first time. And we were the only white people that a lot of people there had ever seen. And so they would, when we would walk around, they would run after us and they would point to us and they would say in Pidgin, their local language, they'd say, white skin, white skin, white skin. Mm-hmm. Because, and especially Elizabeth, long blonde hair, they'd never seen anything like that before. So we really stood out. And it just really opened my eyes of, and like you said, having the language, knowing the right things to say. And sometimes it's very frightening that you're going to say the wrong thing. So instead of speaking up, it's easier to stay quiet or to ignore it because it's so uncomfortable. So it's easier to step back and walk away instead of putting yourself in a position of where it's scary, where it's uncomfortable, and having these opportunities to try out the words, to use the language, to express. It's a learning process, and it's an eye-opening process as well.
Yeah, it is. And we have to, again, the best thing that we can do as educators and as parents is to create the spaces. My daughter is 5 years old. And as I was up last night scripting some of this and helping a colleague and friend of mine, I was talking to my husband. My husband is Jamaican. And, he is Jamaican. He's Jamaican. So he's Black. And he is, but his ethnicity as a Black man, he's coming from Jamaica. And that's his nationality. And so, he'll correct people when they say, oh, he's an African American. He's like, I'm not, I'm a Jamaican. And my wife is African American because my wife has African descent, but she was born in the United States. And so we do have to have these corrective conversations. And, talking about our daughter, she is 5 years old and goes to a very diverse school, and her friends, all of them don't look like her, but she understands the differences already. And we talk about that. And so you have to create the spaces and opportunities and also the room to make mistakes. Mm-hmm. I have friends who are not Black, and they will ask questions, and I welcome that. I don't get offended at all, because I think it's better for you to ask the questions in a safe space than you get it from the media or television or some other unsavory caricature that is, not true, stereotype. And we do that. We also talk about stereotype threat, where, the assumption is if you're of one ethnicity, you represent that entire ethnicity. Yes. And so you also have to correct people with that when they say, well, why do all Black women do? And I have to correct them and say, I don't know, because I don't know all Black women. I know me. Yeah. I know the Black women in my family. I know the Black women, my friend group, but I don't speak for all Black women. So, just like you don't speak for all white people or all people from Louisiana, or for whatever group that you ascribe to. So we also have to dispel that with our kids and parents as well.
So what steps to move forward? So you have educators, administrators trying to figure this out. Coming into next year, this is going to be a topic that people are going to want to know more about, going to want to discuss. It's still going to be something happening in our culture that will affect our students, our teachers, administrators. What are next steps that maybe you could give advice? We'll include some links for resources at your suggestions. But what words of advice or words of wisdom, words of hope would you impart upon these teachers and educators and parents too, trying to figure out what to do with all this?
Yeah, I love how you said words of hope. And I really hope, I want Nora and Elizabeth to chime in at any time, because I do think that conversations like this, they absolutely give me hope, because that means that we're having the conversations. And that's a start, right? Just to even have the conversations. And again, embrace that there are some disparities. And are we comfortable addressing and challenging them? So we have to be willing to have these conversations. The first thing is, first say, we're going to do it. Let's examine our policies and procedures. Are we living in a diverse and an inclusive environment? And so we have to first understand, well, what does inclusion mean? Inclusion means we welcome everybody. So we are faith-based Catholic leaders and educators, but are we really saying that we embrace and that we accept everyone? And if our policies don't ascribe to that, meaning, do our students have teachers that don't just look like white men and women? You can't, say that we're going to be inclusive if we only have one population. And then I've also heard, well, we don't have people that apply. We'll go out and find them. Go out and find them. Go out and advertise and talk to the Black parishes and the brown parishes and the parishes where there are Asian Americans and Asians who want to teach, and Black Americans and other people who we want to represent a diverse fabric. So that's number one. Again, challenge the curriculum. Is the curriculum diverse? Do we have other contributors and storytellers who don't look like the majority? Books are really important. Have we talked about, are we comfortable talking about what white privilege is? Again, I mentioned Peggy McIntosh's work and White Fragility. Those are two books. Peggy McIntosh is seminal meaning her research guides and underpins most of these conversations, because we've been having those conversations about white privilege for quite some time. White fragility is on the newer spectrum, and it's a very fresh perspective. And so that's a great book that you would want to link to your viewers. The other thing is the American Pediatric Society. They just came out with a policy brief. Nora, have you heard about it? Elizabeth?
No.
Have you heard about it? So they came out with a policy brief on the impact of racism on children's health. I can send you that link, but it talks about the chronic symptoms of dealing with racism, parents and their children, and how does that impact them over the long haul of being, having to deal with systemic racism. So you have now policy that's being driven that is identifying this is problematic and it's impacting health of children in our communities. So we have to be able to look at also, are we holistically educating our children by not having the conversations about racism? And are we really ready to dismantle oppression and what oppression looks like? So, giving teachers the opportunities to have the spaces in their classrooms, having fish bowls, teachers and educators can do really quick little, Elizabeth, you'll have staff development meetings, correct?
Yes.
So, you could bring out text like what your mom was talking about, white fragility, and you just do a chapter read and you assign it to them to read, and then you all talk about it. It's like a book talk or, a chalk talk. And you have teachers chart out their thoughts on paper. And then you do a gallery walk where people can see the different perspectives, like, oh, wow, somebody feels like that. And it's in a safe way where you don't have to go and say, me, that's what I think, but you can chart it out. So there are ways of making it very amenable in a way that's in the fabric of what you're already doing. Because if you're already having staff development sessions,
right,
that's a really easy way of having conversations. And that's the start. And then it moves into, well, what do we want our school to look like? And that's where the transformation starts, because that means we want to do some intentional things. And that means probably bringing in trainers and having some additional hands-on exercises that you all can model and applicably take back to your classroom.
Absolutely. To add on to everything that Dr. Walters just mentioned, which are all fabulous ideas, I think number one, check your classroom space. What's on the walls? Do you only have pictures of white historical figures? Can you get diversity on the walls in your classroom? You can pull from the Catholic saints. We have such a beautiful diversity in terms of our Catholic faith. So, and then obviously there are plenty of leaders and amazing people of color and from different marginalized groups that should be represented on your walls. If your classroom space is not diverse, you are not creating as safe a place that you could for students to have that conversation. So you can start there within your four walls in your classroom. I think also making sure that, as Dr. Walters has mentioned, making sure your curriculum is diverse. Are you reading texts from Indigenous peoples? Are you reading texts from different authors with various ethnicities from around the world? What is the perspective that you're looking at in terms of the literature that you're reading, short stories, poems, etc.? Even what you're watching. If you're going to show a TED Talk, make sure that it's representative of diverse groups of people. And there are, as Dr. Walters mentioned, literally limitless resources that exist. So just Google it and start there, because there's no excuse any longer for not beginning the conversation and using a diverse curriculum. The last thing that I would mention is make sure as you're dissecting these policies that your school has, you're having conversations with your administration and really looking at data that supports what your school is doing. And that can be at the micro level in your classroom or school-wide. What is your discipline policy? Who's most impacted by your discipline policy? Is it more students of color who are in detention or suspension or whatever your particular discipline policy is? Is there a reason for that? Are there implicit biases that need to be recognized and addressed to change that narrative? Who's taking your AP and honors classes? Who's in accelerated courses? Why does the breakdown look the way that it does? How can that be changed or reframed to make sure that you're really providing equitable opportunities for your students? Inside your own classroom, one really easy, quick exercise as a teacher to do is take a blank sheet of paper and write down the first 5 names of students that come to your mind. Then think, they should be from your class, obviously. Of those 5 students, are they on the list because they're frequently in trouble or cause difficulty for you in your classroom? Or are they students that you have an affinity for? And why does that exist? Or are they students of color? Are they a student that is from a minority group? And then go back to your class roster and see who didn't make the list and why aren't they there? And continue to do that exercise. If you do it once a week, your list should get more and more diverse and should eventually include all of the students in your class. So I think that those are just some of the small, tiny things that you can be doing on a regular basis to have these conversations to make sure that your classroom is a safe, inclusive space that loves God, loves Christ, and hopefully makes changes moving forward.
I want to take Elizabeth with me.
I know. I want her to be my teacher.
She nailed it. I mean, that is so, I love how you brought it on the micro level, because that's exactly it. I mean, that exercise alone with looking at your students and looking at the names, we do that exercise. I do that exact exercise. And we do it in a circle map where they have to put their names and then they have to share what their strengths are, because we do a lot of work with Carol Dweck as well, if you're familiar, Elizabeth, the strength-based model. And that's where I want teachers to start. And it's like, okay, name those 5 kids, name their strengths. And that is it, because we tend to look at it from a deficit, like, oh, they talk too much. Well, can't we just say that they're verbal and they're participatory and, you know, they want to boss everyone around? Well, can't we just say that they're natural born leaders? But you nailed it. I'm so pleased to hear that, because that's exactly some very easy and tangible things that any teacher can do, pre-K to 20. And when I say 20, those are my big kids, but that's something that any grade level can do. And a very easy way to get your conversation started and action started in the classroom.
Absolutely. And to know your students. You have to, right? Like, what is their ethnicity? What is their heritage? What is their culture? What's important to them? What kind of music do they like? What do they watch on TV? What can you pull from to really know them as people? As Catholic educators, we educate the whole person. So how can you know their background and then invite them to celebrate that in the classroom so that other students can learn from their perspectives?
That's beautiful. And Nora, if you have any, hopes and, you mentioned the document, which is so integral. And even I was thinking about the document in terms of what Dr. Walters was saying at a staff development, break open the document, take pieces and chart it, right to our teaching. So Nora, if you can share your thoughts as well.
Well, I was thinking exactly that, Bridget. Especially, I'm thinking of myself from the parent perspective, of the parent who might be resistant to this being uncomfortable in the classroom, or what's my child going to be learning? If you go back to what Open Wide Our Hearts teaches, the last part is that we should walk humbly with God. And so what does that mean? How do we walk humbly with God? It requires action on our part. Our hearts have to be transformed. And so we have to do that examination of conscience, which is a foundational part of our faith, to ask, to have our minds and our eyes open to where we are sinful, either in acts of commission or omission. And so we have to pray for that eye-opening, and then we have to ask for forgiveness. And that is really a fundamental part of our faith, is that we reach out to other people and seek reconciliation with people we might have hurt. We ask for forgiveness from God. And so those are like the 2 first steps for the transformation of the heart. And then we have to be open to what encounters are put in our path. And so that may be a teacher or an administrator who's pushing us a little bit outside of our comfort zone, but that's where we're being led. And so we have to be open to that. And what I wanted to say is that as Catholic people, or as Catholic Christians, our focus is the salvation of all people. I mean, that is our ultimate goal, is that the kingdom of heaven will begin here on earth. and that we will all rejoice together around the throne of God in heaven. And what does that kingdom look like? It's a very diverse kingdom. And, we can look at the scripture in the book of Revelation where it says, a great multitude, which no one can count, from every nation, race, people, and tongue, stand before the throne and before the Lamb. And so that should be our model of what we want. We're all united together. We're standing before the throne of God. We're rejoicing and worshiping together in equality with justice. And so when I see that that's what John saw in Revelation, that was his vision, I have hope that that's where we're being led, and that should be our goal. And I feel like if you present that to Catholic families, Catholic administrators, they're going to say, yes, that's what I want, because that's what my faith teaches.
Right. Well said.
Yeah, very well said. Well, ladies, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been beautiful. And if anyone has questions for Elizabeth, Nicole, or Nora, just leave us a comment or reach out to me, and I can put you in touch with them. They clearly have a passion for this type of dialogue and just want you to start the conversation. So Nicole, Elizabeth, Nora, thank you so much for being available and being vulnerable and just sharing your experiences. It's so beautiful to dialogue with you on this.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you, Bridget. You did a great job moderating. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for organizing.